Hey folks, Larson Halleck here, personal trainer and giant nerd. Yeah, we're talking about video games today, and one video game in particular. I freely admit that as a hobby, games are not in the least constructive, and correspondingly, as I've grown up, I have bills to pay, and dedicate most of my free time to my creative endeavors, my time playing games has vastly decreased. But I still feel that video games have the potential to be a great art form, and should be taken seriously. The fact that the games that are currently trying to be art are fucking terrible, that's an issue for another day. Today, I wish to talk about a game that, upon first playing, instantly ingratiated itself into my heart as a classic of the medium. And as you can probably surmise from the title of this video, a game that is as relevant to masculine men, and neo-masculine men in particular, as any video game could possibly be. Hell, I would argue that most works of fiction, period, don't cast as much of an earnest yet critical gaze on masculinity as this game, Team Eco's Shadow of the Colossus. Now, of course, to clarify, there are certainly many works out there criticizing masculinity, but as you can imagine, it's all from the court-approved, men should be more like women, men are the cause of their own problems, masculinity sucks perspective. Video games are certainly not adverse to the plasticky, women in tight pants kicking asses shtick. But no, Shadow of the Colossus views masculinity as something of a sympathetic, tragic state. Tragedy in the ancient Greek sense. A character trait that takes a man to colossal heights and dismal lows. A nuanced and three-dimensional view of the tactical virtues that only an intellectual man could understand. And of course, Shadow was spearheaded by a man. Anyway, let's talk about the game. Shadow of the Colossus is a game that I have jokingly referred to in conversation as Robert Howard's The Legend of Zelda, for reasons that are pretty evident if you are knowledgeable of Howard's life and times. Semi-requited love, personal tragedy, quixotic efforts to be great, and a dark and dismal view of humanity characterize Howard's work, in contrast to the black and white morality, but still very enjoyable and compelling, fantasy morality of somebody like Tolkien, which in my opinion is what Zelda bears a much greater resemblance to. This game is about a young and somewhat effeminate man and the woman he loves. The man, Wander, comes to a forbidden land, a land of death and decay, carrying the beautiful corpse of Mono, a woman's sacrifice for some unexplained reason, upon his horse, stopping in a temple and waving his stolen sword about. The disembodied voice of Dorman, a mysterious entity, or rather entities, tells our hero that they, Dorman refers to himself with the royal we, can bring this woman to life, but there is an enormous price to pay. Go out into the wasteland, find the 16 Colossi, and slay them, and Mono shall be brought back to life. And so, leaving Mono upon an altar, and leaving the temple, the quest begins. The game essentially consists of long periods of riding through beautiful voids upon your valiant steed to reach the location that your sword points you towards. A location that, without exception, will throw you into an absolutely harrowing fight against one of the Colossi, teen giants of ambiguous origin, odd beauty, and terrible power. Fitting what I said about the, for lack of a better term, realism of this unabashedly fantastical game, the Colossi pull absolutely no punches against the little pest nipping about their ankles. They will stomp, punch, shake, smash, run, fly, swim, and do anything else possible to kill you. And then there's your fighting moves. In contrast to a Legend of Zelda or some other similar action fantasy game, there are no weapon upgrades, special skills or techniques, or anything remotely stylish or likable about the combat. Wander, armed with nothing but a sword and bow, fights just as dirty as his opponents. The arrows are almost always aimed at the neck, the eyes, the wings, or the inflating air sacs of the giants in order to bring them down to a manageable height. Wander will then proceed to mount his foe, climb up his back, hair, wings, bones, whatever, find the soft spot, and jam his sword into it until it dies. There's no magic or special attacks or anything to take your mind off the sheer brutality of your actions, just the ability to adjust the strength of your stab. Geysers of black blood erupt from the stab wounds you inflict, and this barbarism continues until either you or the Colossi are dead. Well, that sounds pretty cool, Larson, you might be saying, but what the shit does this have to do with masculinity at all? To understand why, let's look at the game thematically. Shadow of the Colossus is often cited as a companion piece to Eco, a game made by the same company. They both share similar artistic choices such as minimalism and use of color and lighting for mood and effect. They are, mild spoilers, unambiguously set in the same universe, and they both have plots that heavily revolve around the young people in love. Just ballparking this, Eco seems to involve younger characters than Shadow of the Colossus, and as such the romance between the boy and girl is rather cute and innocent, showing the protectiveness a boy has for the girl he loves. Shadow of the Colossus, on the other hand, shows a romance between older teenagers or young adults, and makes it substantially darker, showing the fanaticism and madness that love can drive a man to. Wander, I feel, is typical of a lot of young men. He's certainly a lot like me when I was a teen. He is a headstrong idealist to the point of being kind of an idiot, to be honest, madly in love with a girl that he may or may not actually know very well. Interestingly, the game leaves it very ambiguous as to what exactly the nature of the relationship is, and Wander is willing to do anything for love, to the point where he'll just take the advice of a shifty character to gallivant off and kill stuff without even once thinking about any sort of ulterior motive. Adding to his corrupted everyman sort of characterization, note the scrawny mediocrity that is Wander's physique, and his utter lack of skill and technique that he has in his swordsmanship. Indeed, attempting to swing the sword when walking around not on a Colossus shows Wander to clearly have no training whatsoever, and sometimes he'll just trip over his own 2 feet for no reason. As an aside, Wander is, however, highly skillful in horsemanship and horseback archery, so some may question whether or not he is truly an everyman. Considering the way the plot goes later in the game, I would argue that there is some evidence that his culture is an equestrian culture, and thus all men of that culture would be horsemen. Anyway, to paraphrase H.L. Mencken, when it comes to romance, men are the romantics and women are the pragmatists. Man is too doltish, too naive, too easily deluded. History has shown that there have been many analogues to Dorman, taking advantage of the masculine spirit and idealistic romantic tendencies of young men to recruit for the military or some other miserable task. In fact, the book War Before Civilization, which I reviewed not too long ago, cites examples of the women of tribal cultures shaming the cowardly and hesitant warrior and goading him into battle, so there have likely been Dormans as long as there has been battle at all. Note that the exploitation of masculinity still goes on, even in this day and age that denigrates and eschews masculinity as some atavistic nonsense. Those who would shame men for not submitting to the ritualized shaming and humiliation will always try to goad them into it by using the language of manning up. Man up and pay into a system that doesn't do anything for you. Man up and wear women's shoes. Man up and stick things up your butt, and so forth. Anyway, as the dead colossi begin to pile up and Dorman continues to advise and exploit our hero, to be fair, he does prove himself to be honorable in giving advice and upholding their end of the bargain. What's shifty about him is his motive for all this. Anyway, Wander begins to undergo marked physical change. He gradually becomes more pallid and haggard, and his veins run black. Gradually, it is revealed that those who originally sacrificed Mono are trying to stop you, and the conflict builds to a destructive climax. Without revealing too much, I will say that Wander's physical change is a symptom of a far greater spiritual and moral change, symbolic perhaps of the corruption that the killing of the Colossi has done to his soul. At the end, it's difficult to decide whether or not the quest can be considered righteous at all. Of what little we see of Mono, she seems like a nice girl, and the doves surrounding her in the temple are a rather explicit expression of innocence and chastity. But the time comes where any young man who has a sweetheart and he has to sacrifice for her, he must ask himself, is she really worth all this? The abrupt and undoubtedly deliberate musical change that occurs when you start to get the upper hand over the Colossus you're fighting, a stirring and heroic theme of battle, that turns into a somber and grim dirge as the Colossus hurtles to the ground dead. Seems to be symbolic of the rush of adrenaline and heroic toil that is battle, turning into regret when the dust clears and the warrior catches his breath, as if to ask, was any of this worth it? Now, to speak from my own experience, and again, this just might be me, but whenever I got into a fist fight in school or whatever, whether I won or lost, and I've done both, I would feel miserable and ashamed of myself for succumbing to this atavism once the adrenaline of combat died down. The musical sea change embodies that emotional roller coaster. In his quest, Wander fights like a man possessed as he clings to the scrotal hair of his giant foes, enduring brute force, frigid water, scorching sand, and searing winds, all in the name of love. His determination and bravery is certainly something to be respected, but these traits render him, at best, a tragic hero due to the fact that his heroism and bravery are essentially pointed in the wrong direction. Frankly, I'm not sure if you can say that there is a right direction in this case, because he lacks the worldly wisdom of an older man and is motivated into the committing of atrocities by the idea of a woman presented to him by a manipulative entity. Thus, much like the famous Nietzsche quote, he fights monsters only to become a monster himself. This, again, has many parallels throughout world history, as plenty of wars, some would say the majority of wars, have been fought by poor, idealistic young men, ordered to kill by war profiteers and ideologues that wouldn't be caught dead doing any of the fighting themselves. How, might I ask, is Wander any different from some young kid from the American heartland, duped into going to Iraq to find weapons of mass destruction and defend democracy, only to come back and find a country that spits upon everything he thought he was defending? I do not claim to know what the writer of this game had in mind when he crafted this tale. All I can do is give my interpretation of it, which is that Shadow of the Colossus is a tragic tale of a young man's love, strength, courage, honor, and idealism being cynically exploited and suffering horrifically because of it. As masculine men, neo-masculine men at that, we know that men and women are not the same, and we know that a man is far more likely to do insane things for love, and is far more likely to fanatically dedicate himself to something such as, but certainly not limited to, a woman. And with our perspective, we should understand why the events depicted in this game took place, how to avoid similar manipulation in our own lives, regardless of the source, and how even a video game can provide a meaningful life lesson. Do whatever you need to do, just play this game and beat it now. I'm Larson Halleck, keep on training.